I'm endorsed.
Yeah.
We're friends.
We've moved to email. We're not
All right.
moved to phone yet.
I just hope to meet him someday and thank him for his book.
Such a lovely man. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to cause anything to start either.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to start in a couple of minutes. I think there are some folks that are still getting here. I just wanted to let you know, please feel free to get water. It is warm in here, so please feel free to get the water and bring it in here. You don't have to wait until we're all done for the refreshments. Feeling ready? Should we do this? All right, we're going to get started. All right, welcome. Thank you so much for coming this evening to Linwood and to our book event here with Cara Meredith. I also wanted to say thank you for being here, and thank you to Judy Wheeler out there for co-hosting this event from Town Center Books. Thank you, Judy.
Thanks, Judy.
For those who don't know me, my name is Jennifer Murdock, and I have the privilege of being the pastor of this church and having a little conversation with Cara this evening. So I'm going to say a little bit about Cara and her book, Church Camp, Bad Skits. They couldn't all have been bad. I know some of them were great. I'm sure they were. Bad Skits, Cry Night, and How White Evangelicalism Betrayed a Generation. So Cara is, I got to put on the right glasses now. Cara is a speaker, a public theologian, author, and development director who found home at a church camp in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Don't try to guess which one it is. I tried and I was incorrect. After serving in various roles, she continued as a speaker at church camps for 2 decades. She has a Master of Theology from Fuller Seminary and a background in education and nonprofit work. She is the author of 2 books. The Color of Life is her first book, and it's also available this evening. And many articles featured in the Oregonian, the New York Times, the Christian Century, and Christianity Today. And she lives with her family here in the Bay Area in Oakland. So we're so delighted to have you here tonight.
Thank you. Excited to be here. Excited for our conversation.
So before I ask Cara some questions, I just wanted to ask all of you, how many of you ever went to church camp?
I'd say a good half of the room.
Right? How many of you really liked church camp? Excellent.
Fewer hands?
Excellent. My confession, I told Cara, I had one experience with church camp. It was with the ELCA. My father was a Lutheran pastor, so Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, which isn't by evangelical standards evangelical. But it was church camp, and it was awful for me. It was absolutely a horrible experience from beginning to end. I was too introverted, too shy, couldn't get all of the relational dynamics, and I don't remember anything about the theology. I just remember going into the bathroom and crying and wanting to go home. That was my experience of church camp, and I never did it again. So 2 decades is something. It's a lot. That's a lot of energy and a lot of life.
Yes.
Yeah.
One might say I was what church camp was looking for. And indeed, and as I write about in the book, and by now if you've read the back cover or have seen anything, I also hold the tension of this. There's a tension of paradox, a tension of the both and. Because for me, because church camp fit me, and I fit the mold, and it was a mutual relationship. I worked in that environment, and that environment worked for me. I thrived there for many decades, and then I didn't.
Yeah.
And most of that was because of my own theological changing my mind, my own beliefs, religiously, politically, culturally, that changed along the way, that didn't fit within that environment anymore.
Yeah. So you spent years as a camper and then years working in a variety of roles. What do you still see as really good about camp? What do you want to hold on to?
I love camp, and as I've said, I criticize camp because I love camp. But that's not the question we're talking about here. I love that camp is in the outdoors. As we were just talking about a few minutes ago, I love camping. I go camping with my kids all the time. My boys and I go into the woods, and that's a different setting than a church camp setting, but it still is about going into the woods. And there's something that happens when you just step outside in nature. For me, I'm inside at my desk, but my desk faces the garden in the backyard, and we just have a little urban oasis of a garden. But there is life when I look out there, when I walk out there and check on the tomato seedlings and the lemon tree and the peas, the sweet peas that are starting to trellis up. So whatever it is, there's something that happens to me and to all of us, I think, when we step into places of nature. I think Christians might say that this is when creation and creator meet. There's a camping enthusiast and author named Jacob Sorensen. He calls church camps or religious camp settings, he calls them sacred playgrounds because they are a place in which people can go out into nature and play and be met by God along the way. So I think that is the first thing, is that I don't think it takes much to meet God or be met by God in such a setting. It's something powerful in nature, in being apart from screens, which, side note, is why a lot of parents today send their kids to camp, is to have them take a break from screens. And I also, it's one of those that camp is fun for extroverts. Camp is campy, camp is funny. So many of my favorite memories happened at camp. I write in this book, I write about the 100-foot Sunday that we would put out in the middle of the playing field. And we connected all these rain gutters together. This might be really gross in a minute, but we connected all these rain gutters together, and then you'd have all these staff people, and one person was on vanilla ice cream, scooping it in, and another person was on chocolate ice cream, scooping it in, and another person was on the chocolate syrup, and another one was on caramel, and then someone at the very end was on whipped cream, and pretty soon you had this 100-foot-long sundae, and all of a sudden the kids run out, and they're like, oh my gosh! You know, and the staff is sitting there going, this is disgusting. Regurgitated spit is about to be eaten by the mouthfuls. But it was just magic. So I think about that, about meeting God, being met by God. I think about the fun. I think about the relationships. And I hold those dear to my heart. And they're a formative part of who I am, of my identity.
Yeah. So you have these kids who are vulnerable and formative.
And there's that.
They're removed from all that they know, so they're really open. You create a really bigger than life experience for them with a lot of emotion in a unique context, and you expect magic to happen, right? Conversion to happen, right? That would be the primary goal, at least, of the camps. There's diversity, but the camps that you worked in, right? That would be one of the primary goals. Of a conversion experience.
Yeah, and we also wrestled with how much, I mean, just behind the scenes, we wrestled with how much to define this. I think if you come from more of an evangelical background, then saying a sentence like the whole point of camp is conversion makes sense. I think for folks who come from more of a mainline or Protestant background, it's something that it's like, wait a minute, what? That's not the point of camp, or that's not the point of God. But I think that's also part of understanding this particular facet or subset of white evangelicalism that I write about. And in that way, the point of these camps, which is also to say the point of white evangelicalism as a whole, we could say it's also the point of VBS that might happen at a church in the summer. The point is to get kids or campers or humans from point A to point B, or point A to point Z, whatever the letter we want to use, and to get them from a place of not believing to believing, or maybe from a place of believing half-heartedly to believing in a huge way and being super on fire for Jesus. But in that way, that's how a camp, that's how and why many of these camps exist, is to convert. At what point, though, do we cross the line? At what point is conversion okay or not okay? But at what point do we cross the line? At what point is conversion conformity? At what point is conversion something that is taking away free choice? When different elements are a part of that environment that are unsafe and harmful. I'm trying not to get to your other question.
Well, I'm trying to figure out how to lead right into the next one. I'm like, ooh, should we go to the other question?
We'll have a little Q&A.
Yes.
We'll chat for a little bit, and then we'll probably have like 15 minutes of Q&A, and then we'll buy Judy out of her books.
Yes,
and
that's
support
exactly
Town
how
Center,
that's going to happen.
And we'll do that.
So if you haven't read the book, you haven't looked at the book, the chapters kind of follow the themes of each day of camp. So my questions try to follow in that order too, so we'll see if it works or not. So one of the things that you talk about in your book is kind of the image of God that is presented at camp, which you describe as mostly Father, right? And along with that comes a kind of culture of how gender roles should work out under this father figure, and a a culture of purity, and a culture that we would probably consider heterosexist or heteronormative, just assuming that for everyone. So how were gender and sexuality discussed at camp?
Yeah. Well, one quick side note too, just so the way the book is laid out is what you just said, and also my experience, I oftentimes say, so I'll get to that in just a second, but I started going to camp in 1988 when I was 9 years old, and I didn't leave for 30 years. The last youth camp I spoke at was in 2014. The last family camp I spoke at, within, again, under that umbrella of white evangelicalism, was in 2018. So it was a 30-year stint for me. I was a camper, and then I was a summer staffer, and then I became a high school English teacher for a number of years, and I paid rent by being a camp speaker in the summer. So the 7 main chapters in this book are laid out by the 7 main talks that I gave. So that wasn't necessarily the day's theme, but it was the camp speaker's theme. So in a number of the different camps I spoke at, which were denominational, non-denominational, Young Life camps, other parachurch organizations, there was a similar talk progression that was followed. And again, the whole point was conversion. But in that, that was where we were trying to get kids. And so oftentimes then, the first or second night of camp, we were introducing kids or campers to God. And so that's where, in relationship to your question, we introduced campers to God, but we were also solely introducing campers to a male image of God. So for me, I still identify as a Christian. I call myself a Christian. I find a home under the Episcopal tradition now. But for me, I would say, and I think most of us would say, that God is neither male nor female. We might refer to God as father or as mother. Within this environment, though, God was solely referred to as a father male figure. And so for me, that becomes problematic. And that was the language also that I touted for years and years. The pronouns and the examples and the pictures and the images. But what then happens? What message does that communicate, not only to young boys in the audience, but to girls? About who, let alone non-binary identifying individuals, about who God preferences or prefers, about who is most wanted in this scenario. So there is harm that begins to happen, and that then easily plays into complementarian theology. We don't necessarily find that here at Linwood, but this is where we might say there's complementarianism and there's egalitarianism. And complementarian theology or complementarianism is saying that men and women have specific roles, that the male is the head of the house, that the woman complements the man, and essentially there is an over and under that happens. So complementarian values start coming into play in these environments, but that's also where purity culture starts coming into play. The purity movement happened at the height of the 90s, but continues to infiltrate into camps today.
Can you say a little bit about that? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Does everybody know
Sorry,
what purity culture is?
Was there a place you wanted me to read also?
No, I didn't even think about that. Sorry.
Thank you. So purity culture was, I have a couple of great sentences about it. Purity culture is, it's a movement, began in the 1990s. It's a strict view of abstinence before marriage, but also within this movement it's targeting adolescents, teens, and young adults with the message that they were either pure or impure, good or bad, Christian or non-Christian, based on others' assessments of their sexual lives. So this was a huge part of evangelicalism and of white evangelical camps. This was a part of this. There's a great book. It's called Pure by Linda K. Klein, which examines this in full. But this played out in camp in different ways. Everything from some of the skits that happened. And I'll read a paragraph if that's okay.
Yeah.
To things like seminars, like a seminar, 10 Reasons Why You Can't Have Sex Before You're Married. In the almost 50 people that I interviewed, there were so many folks who talked about different seminars that happened, which were all supporting one particular view. You had the one-piece bathing suit. You have a lot of gender division that happens. So one paragraph I'll read to you. At camp, sexual metaphors almost entirely directed toward the female body took up space. Linda K. Klein, author of Pure, this is on page 145, writes about how pure a woman is compared to a brand new shiny car, while an impure one is compared to a used car that everyone around town has already driven and that isn't worth much anymore. A pure woman is compared to a delicious hamburger just set down on a table. Did you read this part?
Yes, but I just forgot how shocking that actually is.
Oh, y'all, this is so real. And this was the world that so many of us grew up in. And there's more also we can connect the dots on, but how might this be related to what is happening right now in our country and to the values being touted by our administration? An impure woman is compared to the last slobbery bite of that hamburger. In another example, one interviewee remembers rose petals being ripped off a rose. The speaker would stand on the stage, an unblemished virginal rose in his hands. "Who wants this rose?" he'd ask, leaning down and passing it around to some youth. He'd then take a petal or two off and then ask the next person to do the same. Eventually, the tarnished, crumpled rose was compared with a camper's purity. Each hand it passed through symbolized yet another sexual partner and, perhaps even worse, yet another piece of a camper's heart. "Who wants this rose now?" he'd ask one last time. Whether or not he specifically called out girl campers didn't matter. Not when women have historically been compared with roses, and the rose itself has stood for a female's reproductive organs. "Women are as roses, whose fair flower being once displaced doth fall that very hour," Shakespeare wrote in Twelfth Night. We may not have uttered such lines from the bard at camp, but the meaning and its intended audience was clear. So those are examples from former campers. And that was just part of what we absorbed.
So to me, it's like, it has nothing to do with my religious experience of my growing up life. I mean, gender would have almost never been talked about, but sex was just like not a topic for church conversation at all of any kind whatsoever. You just do not discuss that, right? And I don't think it would have been discussed that way had we, even though we did, absolutely, God the Father was how I grew up. But it's always been very interesting to me that it seems to come from a very intentional focus on just a couple of elements of Pauline theology, and has nothing to do with anything Jesus said, because he never referred to anything about that. It just was not part of his topic for a conversation or teaching, but certainly focuses on, maybe a chapter from Ephesians and maybe the idea that women can be saved in childbearing. But the idea that females are responsible for male sexual thoughts and need to control themselves in order to control men is such a deeply damaging thing to do to young men and women.
Absolutely. And I just read and then wrote an article a couple of weeks ago that was showing staggering numbers of the amount of folks, really of grown-ups now, who are leaving the faith of their childhoods. I mean, the number just 10 years ago was that 10,000 people a day were deconverting, from Christianity here in the United States. So you then think then fast forward 10 years, we've had the pandemic, we've had major political upheaval, we've had such cultural changes, and that number has nearly doubled. Where and I sit here and I go, well, of course, if this was the message, because shame was so ingrained, if this was the message, where was God in this? Where was a message of love and acceptance and belonging? And to me, that is the greatest gift that camp could give, is that reminder of who we really are, regardless of whether or not someone accepts that message.
Yeah.
And yet so of course people are unpacking and deconverting and wrestling with that, because they don't need that. That's not,
Yeah.
Oh, I can't even formulate a complete sentence. It's so disgusting.
But messages of shame do have power.
Absolutely.
And I can certainly relate to a religion that was shame-based.
Yeah.
And I definitely grew up with that as well, which kind of gets us into the next topics, right, around sin and particularly Cry Night, which also has, I guess, a variety of different languages that might have been used in a variety of different camps, but the idea is the same. And it all relates to just the fundamental sense of why we need Jesus to save us from our sin, and the idea that we are depraved without Jesus, right? And so it really focuses very heavily on, yes, the penal substitutionary atonement model. Lovely name. I definitely grew up with that. 100% grew up with that model, didn't know it, and didn't know until I was in seminary that there is no doctrine of atonement. There is no agreement, and there's so many ways of thinking about the cross, because that is definitely what I was taught in a variety of ways, that Jesus paid the price that was ours to pay, that there is a wrathful God who, I always imagined it like a saber-toothed tiger in heaven, just really wanting to devour us, but somehow Jesus stood in the gap and saved us. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how that theology plays out in camp, and imagine that you're like 15, maybe younger, right? And you're in this emotional, intense experience, separated from your family, and now you get to Cry Night. And what are you told about who you are as a human being and what Jesus can do for you?
I mean, can I read another little essay?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
This we are kind of making this up on the spot. We talked through it, but so this is actually an essay that I think is best suited for The Onion, which is a fictional publication. But this essay is entirely rooted in truth. And if I were to go paragraph by paragraph, I would show you the different interviews that I gave and how I pulled lines from different interviewees. So I want you to listen for the truth even as I read this little essay. Penal substitutionary atonement, an atonement theory widely embraced by a number of conservatives, mostly within the Reformed tradition, is damaging children and youth at record numbers. A robust presence within much of white evangelicalism, its tenets are regularly preached from the pulpit, taught in Sunday school classes, and stated in bold font on the What We Believe section of church websites. The atonement theory capitalizes on making people feel like a piece of shit in order to understand their need for God. Nowhere is this felt more than during the summer months, when thousands of children and youth attend church camps across the U.S. If I can make children feel dirty and worthless, then I've done my job, Larry Goberry, a veteran camp speaker, said. They only have to marinate in their dirtiness for a day, sometimes even half a day, but then they're primed and ready to hear the good news. According to Goberry, even though their worthlessness prevents them from having a relationship with God, children and youth don't have anything to worry about. God loves you so much that he killed his only son, Goberry added. That's the good news. The harmful theology is particularly damaging to those under the age of 18. Not only do they grow up believing God's love is conditional and remain prone to guilt-induced, works-based models of faith, but they believe themselves worthless sacks of garbage. I'm a dirty, rotten little sinner, a 10-year-old girl shouted as she stepped off the bus from summer camp. I'm a worthless piece of poo, a 17-year-old boy added, high-fiving her at the bottom of the steps. Opponents urge the church to stop flipping the switch on God's love and put an end to penal substitutionary atonement as a way of explaining the cross. Although the theory works in the short term, the outdated model ends up doing more harm than good. Record numbers of former campers are leaving the faith, report low self-esteem, and continue to unpack the harmful theology long into adulthood. Proponents remain unconvinced. Why change what works? One pastor stated in response to the accusation. Church camps refuse to comment when asked. So oftentimes in these environments, again, that was fictional, but it was rooted in a lot of truth. In these environments, there is a switch flipped in which a message of God and of love is presented, and a message of Jesus being the brightest and shiniest and most winsome and most loving person, superstar, superhero of all. And then the switch is flipped, and children are oftentimes told that they are worthless, that they are sinners, that, again, this is the big theological speak, is human depravity, that they are absolutely separated from God, that there is nothing that they can do, nothing they can do. This is where some of us might remember that illustration of the two cliffs, and you had God on one side, and it was always man on the other, and how desperately man wanted to get to the other side of the cliff with God, but he couldn't. So the only way God or man could get to God, or God could get to man, was through the cross, through Jesus. So then oftentimes the next night, that's where you have an atonement theory practice, which is penal substitutionary atonement theory. And it is God paying a debt by killing his son on the cross. That is what I grew up with. That is what I preached for 30 years. Well, I guess I didn't preach for 30 years. I wasn't preaching as a 9-year-old. But that is what I believed for a long time. That is what I am still unpacking today. I remember hearing for the first time that wasn't the only atonement theory, as you just said, and going, wait, there are other ways to think about what Jesus did on the cross? I don't have to feel bad? It's mind-blowing still. So this is where you have a night, I affectionately call it cry night. Every single one of the interviewees I interviewed had a different name for it. We had cry night, we had serious night, a couple of Presbyterians called it confession night, you had the crosstalk. You had all different names for this night, which was all about getting right with God. And so it was the night in which one officially got to make a decision for Jesus, accepting Christ into their heart for the first time, recommitting their lives. This is where oftentimes the joke is that, I interviewed one woman, she's like, I think I accepted Jesus into my heart 32 times. Because that's what you did. You got right with God. I see some head nods. You got right with God on cry night. And that oftentimes happened with and through tears. But at what point is that is emotional manipulation part of the equation? Groupthink when everybody else is crying. But also elements of spiritual trauma, because shame does not have to have a place in the gospel. So, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a very long answer.
No, not at all. Some of you who know me, I've taught my story a little bit, and that I left the church when I was 17, stopped attending worship, and really thought, I'm just not a Christian. And it was because of penal substitution theory, although I didn't have a name for it. I just knew, something about this is so wrong. You say, Jesus said, if you're looking at me, you're looking at the Father. So then what? What's with the mean father that has to kill the son? I'm really confused. And if he paid it, there's no forgiveness. So why are we talking about it as forgiveness? He paid it. That's debt cleared. No forgiveness at all. What are we talking about? And I felt like it made no sense for everyone else that I knew of so many different faith traditions that seemed so faithful and alive in God. And so for that and the exclusion of my gay and lesbian friends, I was like, I'm done. I'm not done with Jesus, but I'm done with church. Yeah. And it took 10 years to figure out that it was a version of church. And there are other versions and other ways of thinking. But interestingly, I didn't really unpack the shame and how much shame it really brought into my childhood until much later, probably into my 30s. But I remember being on my knees every Sunday saying, I am a worm and no man, please forgive me. Right? Yeah. And not knowing why I was a worm. the confessions of the church. I mean, it's in Scripture, right? But it is a psalm. It is one person's personal reflection. It's not meant to be so universal. Camp culture, right, creates a deep sense of belonging for those who are there, right? Deep bonding experience and a belonging to Jesus, that you're part of the family of God. You're loved, you're secure, your eternity is secure. But that belonging is predicated on believing the correct things about Jesus and performing the correct gender, right? Coming from the correct family and being straight. So what does belonging look like to you now? And what can Christian belonging be about if we don't need to draw those lines?
I'll say before I started the book, I had a hunch that exclusion was happening in these environments toward three particular people groups: women, people of color, and the queer community. And I felt like my hunch was proved correct. This is something that I go into in depth within each of those people groups in different chapters. But to me, who God is and who Christ is and who the church is then supposed to be is a place of belonging where there are no caveats to belonging. So it's then not about conformity. It's not about any of the rules and regulations and the do's and the don'ts that we place. It's not around or about the perfect prayer that we utter or the clothes that we wear. There's a poignant paragraph at the end of the book. I say paragraph because I'm not the one who wrote it. Someone else wrote it. But from a black queer man who's now an Episcopal priest. But he said, I lamented the fact that they made me think that I had to wear chacos and comfort color shirts. And no offense, if you are a white individual who likes to wear chacos and comfort color shirts. But he says they did this at the expense of my blackness, and they made me feel that who I was as a black man was not important. There was an erasure that happened. So for me, whether we're talking about the LGBTQ community, I felt honored. I identify as a straight woman, a straight white woman. I'm white. And I felt honored to hold the stories of queer identifying individuals who were brave enough to tell me their stories, many of whom were brave enough to let me share their stories, because many of them experienced utter betrayal at the hands of these places in the name of Jesus. And when they came out, or when they were outed, or when they were found out, they were excluded, and they were kicked to the curb, and they were never allowed to return, or they were never allowed to be hired back. I mean, the stories were unfathomable to me. And the reality is that I recognize my complicitness in that for a long time, that I was part of that environment. Even if my own theology was changing when I was still speaking in these places, I still contributed to it because I was still embracing a version of who I thought people had to be. To me, I find great comfort in being in a space now in which all are welcome at the table. And there are no caveats to belonging. So to me, that's who I want the church to be. That's how, to me, the church is to be a place of embracing and accepting love, of the love that is already present, more than it is about having to believe before you belong, to say something before you belong. So the last thing I'll say is that the two people that the book is dedicated to, Michael Weldon and Sarah Powell, they are two camp friends who changed the story for me. And the reality is that those two camp friends are two queer identifying individuals who were kicked out in the name of Jesus. So Sarah's story is told in this book, Michael's is not, because it's not mine to tell in the book. But yeah.
Yeah. I think belonging is, it's our fundamental human need. I mean, we say love, but in essence, we feel that in belonging and feeling we belong in a family, we belong in a community. And I really like Brene Brown's thoughts around that most of us settle for fitting in, right? Which is we are a part of some group where we feel we have to hide parts of ourselves in order to look like everyone else around us. But belonging is knowing deep within that you already belong everywhere you go. And I think belonging is afforded to us by God because we're here. God already says, you belong, I've put you here. I've created you as you are. But it's a really hard thing to create human community that way. I know that when I did come back to Christianity, I mean, I was having inklings, you know, the way God does, waking me up in the middle of the night at midnight, and I'm writing in my journal, like, oh, I don't know, what is this Christian stuff coming up again? But I really came back to Christianity because I found a community of belonging, like the first reconciling congregation that I'd ever heard of, a place that was very theologically diverse, so theologically diverse that later when I would tell people where I was going to church, they're like, you found Jesus there? We thought everybody just like, I don't know, did like moon dances and stuff. Like, no, there's a lot of Jesus there. And that was essential for healing, I think. It's a huge part of healing. And I think it's what Jesus was trying to do, create a community of belonging. I'm going to ask you, I did write down these pages, so I'm going to ask you to read a little bit from, I think it's the bottom of page 23 to 24, a little bit about your own, we talked about what's the right language for this? Spiritual evolution, spiritual journey, that's so overused, right? But you no longer work for Young Life, you don't speak at camps, you don't consider yourself a part of the evangelical circle, but you're still deeply Christian. So how did that happen, right? How did that process begin to happen for you? And I have the bottom of page 23 to the top of 24.
Oh, gotcha, okay. My conversation with Jackson makes me think about my own spiritual journey. I too have walked away from evangelicalism. Just as I mourn the loss of relationships that felt cemented through shared experience, mission, and expressions of belief, I think about the role I played in conversion. Like Jackson, I was a converter. Every word that came out of my mouth had an aim to win over and change, to turn around and bend and transform. Because I believed conversion was essential to the Christian faith, I didn't see anything wrong with this role. That's what I was supposed to do, what we were supposed to do. It was just part of the gig. But something happened along the way. The last thing I wanted to do was try and sell Jesus, let alone feel like I was being sold a version of Jesus. In the end, I didn't want to be a mouthpiece for a gospel that required me to make a commodity of faith too small to shine on its own.
So how did that begin to happen? Can you pinpoint a moment, or is it only like in looking back that you go, oh?
I think there were 1,000 little moments. It was, a couple of you have referenced David Gushee. He's a theologian. He's one of my theological heroes. He featured an essay from the book today, and I was so honored to be on his Substack. He also endorsed the book, which was equally an honor. But I bring his name up because in seminary, seminary is where it happens for so many of us. That was before he changed his mind. And he wrote a book on Christian ethics with a guy named Glenn Stassen, and essentially took a conservative point of view around marriage equality. And I was already wrestling with it. And I remember going to this class on Christian ethics, taught not by him, by another professor, but in which we read Kingdom Ethics together. And one of my best friends at that point was this guy that I called Neighbor Mark. I'd just gotten married, and neighbors Mark and Steve, they lived down the street from my husband James and I. And every morning, Mark and I would go out on the shared lawn of the condo association. It was probably illegal. and we would throw balls to our dogs. I threw the ball to Mr. Darcy, he threw the ball to Ruckus. And we'd go out there, and he'd have his cup of coffee or his oatmeal, and I'd be out there, and he was the most loving, embracing individual. He is still an uncle to my sons. They live down in Palm Springs now. But he would just talk smack because he used to live in that world. And he'd be like, what are you doing working for Young Life? I'd be like, I don't really believe it, Mark, but, pays the bills. I was like, it's my job, it's my identity. And be like, and they hate people like me. So I remember taking this class in seminary and reading that chapter from Gushy and being so pissed. Because I was like, but neighbor Mark, this doesn't go together. Do you know neighbor Mark? Do you know how much he loves me? Do you know, this was years later, but do you know that later when our house was burglarized when we lived in San Francisco, that he showed up that night and gave my kid a bath so that I could go clean up the mess of the robbers having taken underwear out of my underwear drawer? Did you know that when my husband was hospitalized a decade later and was in the hospital for several weeks because it was a big thing, that neighbors Mark and Steve flew my boys down to Palm Springs? And granted, the boys didn't brush their teeth for a week, and we kind of went over that later. But when he found out what was going on, he said, okay, can you get them to the airport tonight? So for me, there were moments like that. That theology class in Florida, I can't remember the town in Florida, but some 2-week theology class in Florida, bawling my eyes out because I thought, David Gushy, you don't have a clue about neighbor Mark. You do not understand. He does now. Gushy is affirming. But it was moments in which I looked around, and I remember one of the last times speaking at camp, looking around and realizing that the majority of people in that room or outside in that campfire pit looked more like me than like my husband, who's black, and our sons, who are mixed race, who identifies biracial some days, black other days, and realizing this doesn't look like the kingdom of God that I know. So there were a lot of little moments along the way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Also, we might have to do Q&A soon.
Yeah, I think we should.
Okay.
And then we'll let's just do
we're
that.
We're going to buy all of Judy's books starting at 8 o'clock. We're going to buy you out, Judy. We got you. Judy Wheeler, Town Center Books, everybody. Woohoo! Does anyone have a question for either one of us?
Yeah, you should be. It's warm. It is. Judy, do you have a question?
Were your camps co-ed?
Oh, they absolutely were. Mm-hmm. Yep. I also say that it was. I recognize the fact that even though I'm a woman, and I do believe a lot of harm happened to women in these environments, I was also a part of white evangelical environments that were at least generous toward women speakers. So there are a lot of camps that absolutely will not let a woman take the stage. So I was in camps that would at least hire me. A lot of times I was the first woman speaker that a camp had ever seen. But I was elevated in that way. Maybe I knew how to open my mouth. But yeah, these were co-ed. I didn't always like speaking to just girls. I wanted the whole room of folks. So they were all hearing the message. They were all hearing a message of God the Father.
Was there any specific denomination that was running this program in the camps?
No, that's early on in the book. I essentially define white evangelicalism. Because the reality is that if you were to say, I want to send my kid to camp, you're not going to look up a place and it's not going to say, we are white evangelicals. White evangelicalism is instead, so there's two answers to your question. White evangelicalism is instead, it can be defined by certainly religious beliefs, by cultural beliefs, by political beliefs. We can say, okay, 2016, 81% of white evangelicals voted Trump into office. 2024, 85% of white evangelicals voted Trump into office. And so we can see voting habits, we can see cultural standards that play out now, that play out now certainly in, well, do I need to go into this? But in hate toward women, in cultural beliefs that are anti-LGBTQ, that are benefiting those who hold the power, and oftentimes those who look like me. So in that way, then in answer to your question, I spoke at a number of different camps. I grew up in the American Baptist tradition. The majority of camps that I spoke at were within the Covenant denomination, within Young Life, within several non-denominational camps. There were several Presbyterian camps. I mean, so white evangelicalism does not discriminate. It is a belief system, and it's a combination of all those things. Those that I interviewed also were from a number of different belief systems. So you have SBCers, you have, there was one woman whose story I feature in chapter 6 who worked at the Billy Graham camp called Cove Camp for a number of years as a seasonal staff employee and then as a full-time employee. This is just a bonus, but this story, one of the stories she told, which I was like, this is wild. But every week as a summer staff employee, they were just so eager to find out who was going to get the Outback Award. So I'm sitting here having a conversation with her, and I was like, what's the Outback Award? And she's kind of playing, she has 2 young kids, she's like playing with her, she's playing Thomas the Toys Trains, and she's trying to like be a mom and have a conversation, and she was like, oh, well, whoever got the most number of conversions in a week, whatever counselor got the most number of conversions, got a $25 gift card to Outback Steakhouse. I was like, no way! Like, that is wild. Like, but I mean, again, if the whole point is conversion, is converting, right. and you have also within.
You got to fundraise.
Yeah, I mean,
you got to tell your fundraisers you
got to
doing
tell
your
your
job.
donors. So, right. I mean, within evangelicalism, it can be defined also by shared beliefs, the Bebbington Quadrilateral of conversion. I always should have this memorized. Of the literal word of God, of conversion, of advocacy, which is not necessarily how we might picture it, like standing on the corner protesting, but it's about sharing the gospel, and about, I think, the Trinity. This is in chapter 1. I'll memorize that for the next one. Bebbington Quadrilateral. I know it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we have a quadrilateral too. It's totally different.
But it's and that if anybody wants to get nerdy for a second. What is the quadrilateral within
Methodism?
Yeah.
That there are multiple pathways of experiencing God. Scripture is one. Tradition is one. Mm-hmm. Reason is one. It has to make sense, and it has to fit with human experience, your experience of God.
Mm-hmm. Did that answer your question? Oh, go ahead.
Not really, but...
Oh. How can I answer your question better without diverting?
Well, when I grew up in a very strict denomination.
Yeah.
And I won't say that at this point, but
sure.
When I found the Methodist,
sure.
I was just aghast
mm-hmm.
at how they allowed you to build your own worship and thoughts of God and who God was and Jesus versus God versus the Spirit.
Yeah.
And I never realized that even existed.
Yeah.
And I was like 30-something
yeah.
by the time I got into Lenwood.
Yeah.
And I think that it was also the Midwest. And the Midwest is very conservative.
Sure.
And so when you talk about finding your own, it is a big variety
sure.
of things. My sister's husband was a pastor for Lutheran, a very conservative Lutheran, and he got up in the front of the congregation and said, "Good morning, sinners." And I
this is where, again, it's kind of hard to define. So read chapter 1 when you get home tonight. That'll be your bedtime reading. But this is where it's not like we can say, oh, these denominations are a part of white evangelicalism, and these ones aren't. Because it is defined or can be defined in so many different ways. There's a historian, Daniel Silliman, who wrote an entire book about defining evangelicals by the books they read. And he said if you look at the books they've read that have been read over the last 50 years, then you can look at the shack and you can say, well, actually, when people read the shack, it was indicative, and he then names these different values. When people read the Left Behind series, it was big on being born again. And that is a value found within that system. So if you look at that and you look at Silliman's argument, you could say, well, we had like half the country reading the Left Behind series. Does that mean everybody's an evangelical? Well, not necessarily, but maybe. So I think that's where it's hard for me to answer the question, and I'll work on an answer for a future event, but it's also, it's convoluted. So we've got a few more minutes, maybe two more questions.
Thank you for writing it, first of all. I grew up evangelical congregational. I was at the camp. I was the counselor.
Yeah.
And the joy and the sorrow, I read the book in a night. I could not put it down.
Oh, thank
Church
you.
camp. Once I saw that, I was like, she knows.
Yeah.
And then there's the holding of both.
Yeah.
The joy,
Mm-hmm.
because it blessed me. It took
Yeah.
me out of a very abusive family.
Yeah.
But it blinded me.
Yeah.
And so all those that I have,
Yeah.
and I was beloved.
Yeah.
I was a fun counselor, and all those I led.
Yeah.
How is it that you hold that, I don't want to say guilt,
Yeah.
responsibility,
Mm-hmm.
ownership of what it is that we
Yeah.
did do?
Yeah.
Oh boy.
In memoir writing, so I oftentimes say this is a spiritual memoir, but it is theological, it is journalistic, but it's mostly spiritual memoir. In spiritual memoir, there's this little known rule that you have to wait a little while before you write about something. Because if you write about something too soon after it happens, you're going to be reactionary. I see that in writers, there might be a lot of bitterness. There might be a lot of anger still because they haven't had time to live the experience.
Mm-hmm.
So the reality is that, again, I don't necessarily call it deconverting, even though that's what a lot of people might call it, but my spiritual evolution started when I was still smack dab in the middle of this world. And I didn't leave for a long time because it was my job and my identity. But the reality is that I've been out of that world for over 10 years, minus the random blip of a family camp in 2018. I have said I'm sorry a lot. I have tried to make right the wrongs. I can't go up to every single one of the thousands upon thousands of kids. That was what I did during the summer, was I would just speak week after week after week. And speaking these messages to 200 kids, 500 kids, week after week, for years. I can't go and reach every kid. I am complicit in a number of different ways. And I also think that I believe I've had time to work through that, to make amends, and to also hold space for the many different parts of who I am, right? Madeline Lingle says, I am the many ages I have always been. And so I sit here and go, well, maybe I am still an evangelical. I mean, not really, but maybe I talk like one when I'm up on stage, But in that way, I hold grace. And I hold honor also for my young self, who didn't always know better and who was doing the best she can.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Last question from a man named Roy.
I think we're all complicit.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And this book, to me, looks like a really big amends.
Mm.
In this past 2 weeks, you've been endorsed by some real heavy hitters. Krista Dumais said I heard her say a year or more ago, she gets so many requests from her, she'll read the whole book, she doesn't do it unless she
Okay. Friendlies, it's been an honor. I didn't even put on my camp hat.
Oh,
Camp
you
is
should do that.
camp is campy. I brought my camp hat because it's fun.